Good morning, children, and welcome back to Mono Valley Studios in Wales. Bunch of gear in here. We're not going to use it today because we're here to go through a mix I did for a fantastic man called The Heavy. And now that I live in the UK, I could be slightly presumptuous and say a local band. They're from Bath, and they are great. If you're not aware of them, you will be almost immediately. The song is called Since You've Been Gone. I'm going to play the whole song so you get a feel for it. It's kind of old school, a lot of soul influence, a lot of what you would think could be kind of loops, that sort of thing built into it. But there are, in fact, no samples on this song. Live drums, live rhythm section, live horns, background vocals. It's a really cool track. And then also, a little bit later on, there's quite a bit that got done in the mix for the middle eight, which is what they call a bridge over here, just so you know. We'll have a look at what I did there, and mix-wise, it's going to go a lot further than some of the other mixing videos I've done, where we're pretty much mixing what's there. We actually created quite a bit in this one section, which is a lot of fun, a lot of automating plugins, that kind of thing. Let's start by having to listen to the song, and while we're doing that, I'm just going to scroll around in the session so you can kind of see what's what very quickly, in case you're not familiar with the way my sessions look. I go top to bottom, drums, percussion, bass, guitars, in this case keyboards. Then we've got some horns, some strings, and lead vocal, background vocal. I'm going to scroll around. Here's how it goes.
And I can't stop crying. Oh,
Quite a bit going on in the arrangement. It's all pretty straight ahead except for the middle 8, but there are quite a few instruments. There is a separate video, which you guys can go have a look at, about session setup, which goes through how I have my template set up in one video and then how I use that template inside of a mix session. So how I import things, how I order my tracks, how I color code. So rather than spend any time on that, I think we can really just sort of dive in. What I'm going to do first is just take out strings, horns, and vocals, and we'll just get down to the band, and then we'll kind of do the usual things, start with the drums, and build the rhythm section back up until we just have the band, and then we'll see how we fit strings and horns on top of an already pretty full arrangement. So if we just listen to the band, I'm going to leave the percussion in, because there's not a huge amount of it. First of all, the drums are funky as hell, which is a good thing. And it really does sound kind of like a sample within the verse, but then all of the fills are played live and things like that. So I think that's one of the keys as to why this song is so awesome. Everything else works around that, but the groove itself is really cool. And then the rest of the instrumentation is really simple, and that, I think, is, again, the key to this. Like, you get to the verse, and you just got the droning bass and piano to give you sort of one tone between the bass and piano, and then you got one little guitar backbeat. But what it really also does is it lets you just listen to Kelvin's vocal and he rules the song. On repeated listenings, you start to pick up on all the little details, and that's what keeps it interesting and brings you back to listen. But on first listen, it is just a badass groove and a vocal. That said, let's break this down to just drums, because that's what we do. We can start going through some individual stuff, and then once we get the band built back up, then we'll start talking about the overall mix, compression, EQ, stuff like that. And I'm actually using a plugin on this mix bus that I don't use on a lot of other mixes, partly because it just wanted to be a little bit more, not lo-fi, but just a different sound. You'll see that in a little bit. So let's just check out the drums. One of the things about the drums, and in fact this whole session, and the whole record really, is that things were recorded to sound very much like what they were going to end up being. If you've watched some of the other videos, you've seen sometimes drums can be recorded in a very flexible way. So there are lots of microphones, and then you can mix and match to kind of get the sound you're going for. I didn't track this record, I've just mixed it. But I did go by the studio while they were doing some recording. When you look at this session, the drums are across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tracks. That's actually split out a lot more than some of the other sessions. I think there were a couple of songs where the drums are just on 3 tracks, because that's what they wanted to sound like. There are a couple of songs where the drums are put to tape. This kit was actually put to tape and brought back, I think more just for a little bit of harmonic distortion on this song, but on other songs, the 3 tracks are completely crushed on tape. So they're really using the recording process as a sound shaping process, not just to capture some people playing instruments and then hope for the best later on. And in some ways, it can be more challenging when you get a song that's recorded this way if it's not done well, because you're boxed into a corner, but it might not be the corner that you want to be in. In this case, I think any shortcomings there may have been on individual tracks are completely overcome by how great the performances are and how cool the sounds are. So, like, one of the things for me getting the rough mixes of songs like this on the record, which are very groove-oriented, were that the roughs felt great, just pushing the tracks up. The groove is there, but there's no real definition in the drums. So me trying to bring out kick and snare, me making sure that the vocal is always on top when he has the kind of voice that you can bury and it'll still work, but really trying to make him lead, making the horn arrangements be a feature and not just another instrument, that sort of thing. So this entire project was very much about that. And then also, like I mentioned before, in the middle 8, on the whole record, the band basically said, look, we love the songs, we think the arrangements are great, we're totally happy with how everything's working, verses and choruses and things like that. We think musically, the middle eights are set up to be exactly what they should be in terms of being a break either harmonically or dynamically from the rest of the song, so you can reintroduce the chorus, you go somewhere else for a minute. But they basically said, do whatever you want in the middle eights. This song in particular, I went pretty far with effects and things like that. So really creating soundscapes from what I was given. And we're going to delve very deeply into that. So I think that kind of sets us up to start looking at individual tracks now. And what you'll see as we go through this is that these sounds are very much the sound of what I ended up using. If you're familiar with my template and the way I set things up, I've got a kick snare crush, which is a mono parallel compressor for the kick and the snare, which I'll take that out for right now. They were already running the drums into a stereo bus, which I held on to. One of my concepts when mixing is whenever possible, I use the session exactly as it came to me. And I don't want the session stripped back to the raw tracks because usually so much has been done in Pro Tools since the thing was recorded to make it work that if you take everything off and take all the automation off, all the plugins, you're not really left with what the song is and what the song became and what made the band decide it was time to mix. So I would actually rather have a much more complicated session that I can simplify myself as I start to figure out what's been used and how it's been used, and then I can assess each thing individually. In this case, there are quite a few plugins that were left in the session, and I think I kept probably 80% of them. And then there are quite a few tracks without too much stuff on, so I'll try to be good about telling you what they used and what I used. The drum kit is going into a stereo aux, which has some plugins on, and then from there, I'm sending it off to both the rear bus, which is interesting because I don't always send the drums to the rear bus, and also to my stereo drum compressor, the Fatso. So I've just taken all of the sends off for the parallel compressors. So we're going to start hearing just raw drum tracks through my 2-bus chain. So we start with a kick, as we usually do. They were using this 88RS plugin. I don't know why, just the engineer who was recording this stuff was using it, and I think I just decided it was good. I'm going to take off my plugin. So this is the kick from tape. So not the cleanest kick drum recording in the world, but it's cool sounding. I doubt there was a hole in the front head, and you can hear a lot of snare bleed. It's one microphone. It's bounced to tape pretty hard. And so you can hear what they were doing to it. Sounded fine to me. A little bit of top end. Well, quite a bit of top end, actually, and a little bit of compression. So I just left it. Now, I may have tweaked, but usually when I'm looking at the plugins that have already been used, I never change any of the controls. I either bypass or I keep it intact. And in this case, I might have bypassed the compressor and kept the EQ or the other way around. Maybe they had a filter on it, which I took out, but it doesn't look as though they did. That's the way I treat their plugins is, okay, is it good or bad? And if it's good, I keep it. If it's bad, I get rid of it. In this case, it was good. And then two things that I almost always put on every drum kit. Here's the kick with some EQ that I added. And it's the usual thing, a little bit of 60 hertz. I didn't actually use the mid-band at all, and a little bit of 12K, no high-pass filter. So this is just a little bit more happy face EQ. And I hope what you're hearing is the same as what I'm hearing, is that it's helping the kick drum, a little bit of length on the release of the kick, but it's actually making the snare drum sound a lot better. The snare mic itself is going to be so much louder than that bleed that it's probably not making a huge difference, but that bleed is there. I'm definitely not going to try and gate that out. So that is part of the snare sound. So I'll just play that again really quickly so you can check that out. You can hear the roughs on the snare a little bit, and also there's something a little bit boxy about the snare without the EQ, but rather than find the boxy bit and try and take it out by adding top end above the boxy bit, it's sort of the same thing, but I'm just getting the benefit of a little added top end, which is bringing out some of the detail stuff in the kick. Then lo-fi. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know all about this. There is one knob on this plugin as far as I'm concerned. It's the distortion knob. I never use any of the other stuff on here. And in this case, not a whole lot, because it's got quite a bit of harmonic distortion going to and from tape and the way they've compressed it on the way in. Just adding a little bit of drive, basically using it just like a subtle clipper. Nothing too crazy, but there you go. So that's our kick. Just really quickly, here's without either of my plugins. Feels like it's got a little more bounce to it. Before I talk about the kick snare crush in this instance, I'm just going to move over to the snare track, and then this way we'll have the kick and snare go into that compressor together, because that's how that compressor is used. Again, with the snare, they've got an 88 RS on there, and then it looks like I've used the exact same plugins one more time on the snare, but here's what they were doing to it. A little bit of brightening, tiny bit of compression. Again, sounds better with it, so I just left that alone. And then move back into the realm of what I usually do. Top end, again, I'm not using the mid control, and I think it's probably because the mid on the kick at 7.2 is more of the attack, which I didn't necessarily want on this kick drum. The 12K was enough. And on snare, I'm usually using the 220 on the low for body, and then if I need extra top, I'll use that 7.2. So I'm not using the mid in the mid-range really, it's sort of the bottom of the air. So I use the mid-range to go along with the high shelf if I need it, and in this case on both the kick and snare I didn't actually need it. So there's a little bit of 220 for the body, and then quite a bit more of the top end, because that snare is sounding a little bit dark. So here's the EQ. Same thing, it's just bringing out all that detail. And then on lo-fi, there's a little bit more distortion, but again, 0.4 is kind of low for me on a snare drum. I'd be usually, I think, closer, sort of 0.6, 0.8, maybe getting up towards 1. But here's the effect of that. Just more fun to listen to. Let me solo up kick and snare together. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mute the kick snare crush down here so I can turn on these sends. And then I'm going to bring the kick snare crush in and out, which is a DBX 160, just over 4:1. And we should see the above light where I'm going over the threshold just on the transients of the kick and snare. I'm not really smashing here, but what this will do is really change the character of the decay of the kick and snare. And because both the kick and snare are going into this compressor, it lets the kick sustain until the next snare drum and the snare sustain until the next kick drum. And for me, it just really sort of reinforces the groove by having the drums extend right up to the next transient. Just night and day. To me, that groove really starts to pop. And again, this is just on the kick and snare. The other thing is, listen to the definition of the hi-hat as I bring this in and out. The hi-hat sort of comes to the forefront because when the kick and snare aren't hitting, this compressor is really bringing up all of the bleed that's going on in between the transients. And in this case, his hi-hat's super, super tight, and the dynamics within it are really cool. And you start to hear that a lot more. Obviously, we're going to get that from the overhead and from the hat mic, but the detail that starts to come out of the drum kit on every microphone with a parallel compression is what I really love about it. So check out the hi-hat now. This is without. good. This is already starting to come together. Now, I want to be fair on this mix. I'm not doing a whole lot to the drums because they already sound really, really cool. And I'm not going to end up doing a whole lot to it. You'll see my usual stuff with the Fatso later on once we get the rest of the kit together. I am sending a little bit of the drums to the rear bus, which doesn't always happen. And once the whole track is built back up, I'll show you what that's sounding like and why I'm doing it in this particular case. If stuff sounds good, leave it alone, is my motto. Should probably have a t-shirt that says that. And it's part of my legacy of laziness, which means I don't want to do stuff that I don't need to do. I could go in and wrench on EQs on these drums and really try and make them sound great. But if in the context of the whole drum kit, the drums feel great, then all I need to work on is what needs to happen to them in the context of the entire mix. And usually that's something I can do on, let's say, this stereo kit bus where the whole drum kit's going through, or adding them to the rear bus if I feel like they're getting lost a little bit and I want the drums to make the rest of the mix interact a little bit more. But there's no reason for me to be doing a huge amount on the individual mics if they sound cool. And in this case, they did. So there aren't any huge problems to fix. I don't need to really put a ton of EQ, so I didn't. Now, this kit was recorded with a mono overhead, which is always fun and interesting. Nothing wrong with that. It's just more of sort of an old school approach. But what was actually cool about that is it left the sides of the mix open for me to move the horns and the background vocals and take up more space on the outside because the hat and the cymbals aren't moving around a whole lot. A mono overhead, and their plugin, they had an SSL on this guy. And again, I don't think I touched this. And let me move to the chorus because that's where there are a lot of toms going on. I think we're going to find that the room mic is going to play a much larger role. And then there's also a low kit mic and some extra drum mics. So I'm sort of building a kit from individual microphones as opposed to the standard multi-mic'd close mic setup. Really quickly, here's what their SSL is doing. Pretty much the same sort of thing I usually do. A little bit of top end, they're not adding low end, which is fine, and a little taste of compression to help bring that up. Because this is a slightly less traditionally recorded kit, as we go, I'm going to keep adding the microphones in so you hear the kit so far, and then you'll hear the kit sort of build up to where we end up. So this is kick, snare, and overhead together. Starting to get a pretty cool picture of the kit, so let's see what's next. We have S. Kind of overall kit mics. They've got an LA2A on it, which I probably turned off the analog if they hadn't already. This in all of the Waves models, by the way. It's a very cool thing that they've actually separated this out. What they've done is they've taken the parts of the model of the circuit that are very noisy but aren't necessarily part of the actual compression part of the circuit in terms of this LA2A. And they've let you, first of all, set them for 50 or 60 hertz because the characteristic noise would be different depending on the power supply. And they also let you turn it off. In this case, I like to turn it off because I use so much parallel compression that noise ends up getting really, really loud, and it's like a really bad amount of tape hiss at the end of the day. I personally turn it off. You lose a little bit of the character and a little bit of the harmonic distortion you might pick up going through the plugin. That's fine. There's so much harmonic distortion going on elsewhere that I'm not really too worried about that. They've got the compressor on here. Pretty straight ahead. Trim plugin, probably pretty straight ahead. Trim plugin, probably from them when they were checking phase, and this is left at 0. I mean, if I was being really anal, I would get rid of that plugin because it's not doing anything, but it's low DSP, so it doesn't really matter. And lo-fi. So this would probably be me. I don't remember specifically, but I think that I decided that this mic was going to be part of my dirty friend with the drum kit. So here's clean. There's quite a bit of gain once you got the distortion up this high, but it's really, that's the character of this mic. All right, now I'm going to play you the kit with those 4 mics so you can kind of hear what we've built up to at this point. And keep in mind that these are all panned straight up the center, so we have a completely mono drum kit up to this point. Sounding pretty cool. I'm going to skip this next track because it's only used in a couple of spots, so we'll go find that in a second. And let's move over to the room track. No plugins at all on this, so we'll just play it for you. Nice crusty room, so here's the kit with that as well. All right, so it's basically just a little bit dirtier with that in. Next, we've got something called low K. A trigger that they were running live and then actually printed to tape and back. What I'll do is I'll play you the kick with and without that. Not making a huge difference, just a little bit of extra knock on the kick drum. And then they've got a snare sample as well, so that sounds like this. They've got a little bit of EQ on it, not a whole lot looking at it. This is what it sounds like without. You can see just a tiny bit of EQ to help blend that in. Now here's the snare with that sample. Just a tiny bit of extra attack, which is good because that snare is pretty long, and to try and get extra attack out of the close mic, you'd probably end up bringing up that ring a little bit. So it's subtle, but it's helping. Really quickly, this track here, which is a copy of the ST mic, which is right up here. And then it's being duplicated and only unmuted where that rack tom is hitting. And what that's letting me do is to add a slightly distorted EQ'd reverb. So basically, it's just letting me add a little bit of length. So what I'll do is I will let the first drum fill go by without it, and then I'll solo it in to add to that microphone. And you'll just hear that tom gets a little bit longer. Sounds a little unnatural with just those microphones, but if we put the whole kit in now. Just gives that tom the length and the room sound that the rest of the kit already has. Without it, it sounds a bit dry. Just yet another little element. And these are the kinds of things, actually, that you need to be thinking about if you're mixing a drum kit that's recorded in this way, where you only have a few microphones. It's not good enough to say, well, yeah, but I didn't really have any options for that tom, so that's why it sounds a little dry. You can't go over to everybody's house who buys the record and explain to them why maybe that tom doesn't sound as cool as it could. You need to make it sound awesome. And, you know, it takes a little while to go through and chop out all that audio, but at the end of the day, it doesn't take that long. And it's the difference between the drum sounding great and the drum sounding pretty good. And I think if given the choice, I would always go for great. Let me just show you what's on the drum kit itself, because there are some plugins we're listening through that are on the kit bus. So the first is an SSL compressor that these guys had put on the kit, and I would imagine this is doing quite a bit. So let me play the drums and I will take this in and out. doing what an SSL compressor does, just helping get those attacks to be a little kind of spongier in a way. It's really sort of helping glue the drum kit together. Then next in line, bypassed EQ. So this is an example of a plugin that they would have had in the session that I listened to quickly and didn't want to use. We'll just go ahead and make that inactive because we're not actually using that plugin. Then next, an L2, bring the level of the drum kit up. It's 4 dB of level, and I'm sure there's quite a bit of limiting going on here. This is where some of that kind of blown up lo-fi kit is coming from. Having that amount of limiting, it's not just gain because you start to really hear on the kick and snare, it gets grainy and it's really bringing up the room, which is cool. It's kind of the character of the drum kit in a lot of ways. I'm just following it with some more lo-fi. Overall, it doesn't matter that I've already used some on the kick and snare. Basically, think of your mix as traveling down through the mixer, like think of the actual signal flow. So I've got my individual kick and my individual snare, and those are channels on my console. And so I make those sound good, and if I need lo-fi to do it, then I use some lo-fi there. And I start to build up my whole drum kit. Now the drum kit might sound a little too clean. Well, there's nothing wrong with doing some more lo-fi later on. Nothing wrong with having 2 lo-fi plugins in a row if that sounds better to you than 1 lo-fi with that knob cranked up more. I think sometimes people will talk themselves out of doing things because like, well, I've already used an EQ on the kick, so I really shouldn't EQ the whole kit. Like, well, yes, you absolutely should, because that's a totally different thing. EQing the drum kit as a whole doesn't mean that you somehow failed in making the drums sound good enough. They're just not done. So downstream, you've got this chance to do some overall stuff, and in this case, a little bit of overall lo-fi, which sounds like this. Bringing some presence back that was maybe lost with the L2, things like that, so it just sounds good to me. So that's the drum kit, and now the only thing left to do on the drums, other than this overdub hat, which I'll play you right now. This is just in the verses. We actually have 2 hi-hats going on, and I am panning those opposite. Inside the drum kit, I've managed to make the tracked hi-hat kind of stay in the middle because the only thing that's actually panned with the drums is this duplicate of the tom, and so that makes the drums go a little bit stereo as well as adding the reverb to that tom in the drum fills. The rest of the kit is very mono, straight up the middle. That tom splits off to the side to make it a little bit stereo. But this hi-hat overdub is off to the left. So now all of a sudden you get 2 hi-hats in the verse. So I give the illusion of a stereo drum kit, but it's a very tight stereo drum kit. It's not crash cymbals. It's not room ambience all over the place. So it keeps my drums right in the middle in a nice little package, allowing me to have sort of more of an old school mono, things panned in different places approach. But we get a little bit of spread rhythmically, which is important. It would be really easy for me to pop that hat in with the rest of the kit and try and make it sound natural. But the idea of it is that it is actually its own thing. And the only thing going on here is some lo-fi. For the sake of completeness, I'll play you that with and without. And there you go. That would be the overdub hi-hat. Overall, the kit is going to this stereo aux, and then it makes its way to the mix bub hi-hat. Overall, the kit is going to this stereo aux, and then it makes its way to the mix bus from here, but I'm picking it off and sending it to a couple of things. So the first is the Fatso. This is my very standard stereo drum compressor. It's one of 2 stereo drum compressors, and on this mix, I'm only using the Fatso. So what I'll do is I'll play the entire drum kit with and without this Fatso, and you can just get a look at how much compression is going on by having a look at the screen. It's really bringing out the decay of the snare, the ring of the snare, and again, it's just more glue. It just sounds a little bit more exciting. Yeah, I just love the way this compressor adds to the rest of the drum kit. On this particular mix, that's all I needed. Again, I'm going to come back to the rear bus because the rear bus on its own doesn't mean anything just for the drum kit. It's about how the drums work with the other instruments. If I put that in now, work with the other instruments. If I put that in now, you'll hear the sound of the drums change, they'll get louder, but it doesn't really have anything to do with why they're in the rear bus to begin with. The only thing I will point out is most of the time, my sends off to parallel compressors are at 0, follow main pan, and post. So that I'm picking up a copy of whatever is going to the mix bus, and that's what goes to the compressor. For the Fatso, that's exactly true. It's exactly the mix of my drum kit going off to the Fatso so the Fatso can be blended in. The rear bus send, though, on the drums is turned down. And that's because I want the drums to interact, but I don't want them to obliterate everything else that's going on in the rear bus. So again, we're going to come back to that later on once we got the rest of the instruments in. What you may have noticed is on a lot of other things that I mix, I'm going for a really impactful kick and snare. Lots of attack, and they're going to really rhythmically drive the song. Whereas this is just not that kind of drum kit. It's recorded in a very stylized way. The groove is very stylized. A great phrase that these guys use to sort of describe the feel of the rhythm section is crate diving, which is when people used to be thumbing through crates of vinyl looking for cool loops and then lift that up and then, okay, there's the loop you're going to use for your song and things like that. And they want the band to feel like that. So it's kind of an interesting sort of inside-out progression of the band where you start off writing with loops, then you become a band that plays and sounds like loops, and sonically, that's the way the band still wants to sound. So it's kind of cool that they've stuck to this sort of sonic vision of how they want their stuff to be. They want it to be dirty. But at the same time, I need the kick and snare to rhythmically drive the kit. So the big difference to me when I listen to the rough mix, let's say, and then my final mix, is the kick and snare are really much more part of the mix as opposed to the drums just sounding like a loop. And that's the beauty of having it played live and recorded live. To kind of point that out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you a little bit of the kit with everything that I've done except the rear bus, and then I'll go back to how the kit was delivered to me. And hopefully what you'll hear is the kit's going to get dirtier, it's going to get a little more fun, but it's also going to be a little bit more defined, which may sound counterintuitive when it gets dirtier, but the kick and snare will be a bigger part of the pattern because they'll just be easier to hear. All right, now let me take everything off and you'll hear it without. So now that the drums are completely awesome, let me just quickly whip through the percussion. There's not a whole lot, but it's some of exactly what you would expect and some other stuff. So there's some claps in the verse, which are very, very quiet in the mix. They just didn't end up being something that really needed to be brought out. And all that's going on with them is there is a compressor which they've put on to just give it that really smashed up, roomy sound. And with the drum kit, when you know they're there, they actually make a difference to the backbeat. Listen to what sounds a little bit like snare reverb that comes and goes, because every other hit has it. It's a very cool effect, and I like having them be that subtle. If they were loud, it's like a bunch of guys standing around, which is not really what it's supposed to be. This has got to be a little bit tough, and I think that just having it sonically change up is very, very cool. Get rid of the drum kit again, and your standard tambourine, or in this case, a yambourine. That's just got an EQ that they put on. I probably put in this high pass, and they've added a little bit of top end. pretty standard stuff. And then when we get back to another verse here, we start to have a few more elements. There's a shaker. Our claps come back, right? Sounding very much the same. But this is in the section of the song that has the drum fills. That's what those 3 claps are doing. And again, it's subtle and it's in the background, but it really does change the character of those backbeats. So I'll play you that fill with and without. Just a little more boring. Very cool with that. And then there's one other thing called drop, which would be them dropping things. And it's just, again, to add some length. So that is going with the claps. So it kind of gives a wind up. And with the drums, just makes the drum kit more interesting, but without calling attention to itself, which I think is very cool. And that's a lot of the sort of mindset of people who build with samples. You'd have a main drum loop, and then you might have a couple of extra little percussion loops that you bring in and out, but you don't necessarily want them to be heard in a big way. So this is that same thing with live drums and live percussion. Like, how do we sort of change the character of the kit on these backbeats and add some excitement to this section? Well, do it with some percussion, but not big, loud percussion. Whereas the shaker is more of a rhythmic thing. There's not much else going on with this. The percussion is not getting any overall treatment, and in fact, there are no parallel compressors on it. The only thing that I'm using is there's an aux for the shaker. It's getting a little bit of effects, and you'll see the effects when I start talking about vocal effects, because it's further down in the session. Just a little bit of top end, but so you can hear what I'm doing. This shaker track goes to bus perk 1. Bus perk 1 feeds this aux, which then goes to the mix bus. I could have moved this send up to the track itself, but this aux is in my template. It was available. I just put it in there. And the reason I left it as an aux was in case I wanted some effects on some of the other percussion. All I got to do is assign it to that bus. It's just a quicker way to work. And it's also really interesting, actually, that the shaker keeps stopping. So again, this entire set with the drum fill and the percussion, as we go through here, let me play you this section with the drums and percussion, all the percussion this time, and then I'll take all the percussion out. And I think you'll really hear the difference rhythmically as it goes by. So the drums work fine on their own, but with the percussion, it's just really cool. And having that shaker stop makes a dum dum ga dum really reset the groove every time. So you go busy, halftime, busy, halftime, busy, halftime. And that section is a lot more interesting than it would be with just the drums plowing through, I think. So that concludes the percussive elements of our mix. And now we can move on to some of the melodic elements.